Welcome to Show Don't Tell. This is another episode on free trade. Today's topic, hormonal beef and chlorine chicken, staple diet of anti-TTIP and anti-free trade campaigners. We'll go into the published science and arguments on both sides and issues, look at the facts and expose the deeper questions that lie behind. As ever, whichever side you take on an argument, do it for reasons that are true, not because of fear-mongering and manipulation. This is Show Don't Tell, so let's get into it. Let's start with hormonal cows. Hormones have been used in cattle raising since the 1950s. Today there are 6 approved hormones, 3 naturally occurring and 3 synthetic equivalents. All of these hormones are administered by inserting a pellet under the skin of the cow. So why ban it in Europe? Well, in the early 1980s, French farmers were so excited by hormones, they filled their cows up to the eyeballs with the now banned hormone DES. This led to baby food with a very high DES level and a panic that abnormal growth and development in children could occur. So what began as a temporary ban became a formal ban in 1989. No hormones, natural or synthetic, to be used in cattle raising. This is Show Don't Tell, so let's look at some science. Here's a 2010 review article with this handy table. On the left is the baseline daily production of each hormone for different groups. Prepubescent children produce the lowest levels of hormones and are therefore most at risk from elevated hormonal ingestion. The next column shows the micrograms per kilo of hormones in the meat of non-treated cattle. There's no such thing as hormone-free meat. Cattle are mammals and produce hormones too. So what's the impact in treated animals compared to the level in untreated animals? Roughly speaking, there's a 10-fold increase in the hormone levels relative to untreated cattle. So assuming you eat 300 grams, that's 10 ounces of meat from a treated cow, what level of hormones will you ingest? The table's final column gives the numbers. For prepubescents most at risk, it's around 1.5% of daily hormone production, but for most cases it's a fraction of a percent of daily production. You might say this still sounds like a possible risk. However, it's been long established that consuming hormones orally is a very inefficient method because only around 5% actually makes it through the stomach and into your blood. So assuming you did consume 0.1 micrograms of estradiol, only 0.005 micrograms, that's 5 nanograms, would be in your bloodstream. So for even the most susceptible people, they receive less than 0.2% of their daily hormone production, a negligible amount. And this theory underpins what we know from actual medical trials and experiments. Ingesting hormones at these levels doesn't result in any measurable changes. So what are the arguments in favour of hormones? Well, hormone treatment creates more rapid weight gain. Cows require less food to gain weight and produce leaner meat. In short, it makes food cheaper. Making food cheaper reduces food poverty, it reduces the cost of living, and the largest benefit comes to the poorest people in society. But what about the risks? We've already covered the theory, and it's not just the Americans who view hormones as safe and use them on their cows. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Mexico, Chile, Japan, South Korea all use hormones too. And the use of hormones is deemed safe by the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and by the Veterinary Products Committee of the United Kingdom. There's also, well, common sense. Most countries have used hormones in beef production for 40 years without any evidence their populations suffered health consequences as a result. So what are the EU's arguments against the use of hormones? Well, until 1999, the EU provided no evidence that these hormones were dangerous. They only did so after being compelled to by the World Trade Organization to justify their ban. The EU responded in an argument not overburdened with merit by stating, no threshold level and therefore no allowable daily intake can be established for any of the 6 hormones. A statement so absurd, the Canadians responded that if it were true, humanity would have been wiped out by cancer millennia ago. Let's be clear, if the EU's position is that there is no acceptable daily intake of hormones, then I definitely shouldn't be eating European cows who have hormone residues too. Go vegan, it's the only safe choice, official advice of the EU. Or should I try and remove all the hormones I have in my body? Is this actually the safer course of action? As to the established clinical data, the EU decides that's all irrelevant to food consumption, therefore we can ignore all of that too. The EU's non-scientific argument does have some merit. If hormones were available to European farmers, would they start using them on unapproved species? Will they double dose animals for greater gains? That's a fair point, but it does raise questions about how the EU views its own farmers. The conclusion is obvious. Like climate change, there is a well-established scientific consensus that using hormones in cattle is safe. There is no scientific justification for the position adopted by the EU, and there is absolutely no threat to public health. So why are they so adamant in their position? Would it surprise you, shock you even, to learn the real issue politicians care about is not the fact that the beef may have hormone treatments? If you've been campaigning that hormones are an actual threat to public health, I'm afraid you have been used by politicians who felt the end of your support justified the means of misleading you about the safety of your health. If you want to know why they're doing it right now, then skip forward about 4 minutes, but if you want to learn about chlorine chicken, stay here. Chlorinated chicken is more straightforward. After it's been butchered, the chicken is dipped in essentially swimming pool water to remove bacteria. We can save time here because even the EU doesn't find any scientific or healthcare fault with this, saying chlorine treatment would be of no safety concern. So what is the rationale for the EU being against it? Well, the EU view is that adding treatment at the end of a production process allows you to get away with worse hygiene further up the production chain. Now, given the similar objection made against hormones that farmers would misuse them if they could, I do sometimes wonder whether the EU knows it has to protect us from our own farmers, but can never come out and say it publicly. But overall, I find this argument ridiculous. Only good things happen from this process. It reduces bacteria without any health consequences, but we're against it because you might see it as an incentive to take risks. It's this confusion of principle on both issues that I find madness. I believe in climate change, I believe the evidence supporting the claims, and I trust in the overwhelming scientific consensus. I also believe in vaccination for much the same reasons. Science has established there are no long-term health consequences, and vaccines provide invaluable protection against potentially fatal diseases. If you also believe in these things, and for the same reasons that I believe in them, how can you believe that the hormonal treatment of cows poses a threat to public health? No one has ever said, I read this article that really broke down the science explaining why hormones and chlorine treatment are a threat to public health. I know this because it doesn't exist. I believe that the wearing of seatbelts should be mandatory and enforced by law, a minor inconvenience to put one on that vastly increases the survivability of car accidents, an accident that can occur for reasons that have no connection to how safely you drive. If you do agree with that position, why also believe that a more effective process of cleaning chicken with no negative consequences is something to stand squarely against because you think it makes people act more dangerously? You're deploying exactly the same argument that people use to oppose the introduction of mandatory wearing of seatbelts. Do people not see the ample conflict in these positions? There are more established phrases to explain this phenomenon than confusion of principle, not cognitive dissonance when you feel a conflict between two ideas, like this.
I think it's a choice later in life, but it depends on upbringing. When did you choose to be straight? That's a good call, man. I didn't choose to be.
What we're talking about here isn't cognitive dissonance. We're talking about not feeling any conflict. In fact, believing passionately in both ideas. And the name for this phenomenon? Doublethink. As George Orwell wrote in the book 1984, doublethink is being able to believe passionately in contradictory ideas. A world where people accept and repeat whatever their leaders tell them, and either can't or don't consult outside sources, creates a fertile environment for this phenomenon. Told to believe in climate change, told to oppose hormones. I don't think people really questioned the science, it's that they trusted the people who told them did, or they thought the people who told them even cared. I've said what it isn't all about, but if you're still wondering, what's really at stake is the EU's ability to enforce protectionism under the guise of public health. The EU don't want foreign competition in agriculture. The hormones, the chlorine, it's all just a means to an end. Prove them safe and the EU will just say, the Americans used the wrong knives, or the clouds are the wrong shape. Looking into these issues is winning battles while losing the war. The usual common sense response to regulation is simply to comply. And would it shock you to learn that since 2009 there has been a scheme allowing US-raised, non-hormonal beef to be imported into the EU? However, the EU permits only a tiny quota, even though this beef meets every EU health requirement. If it's really a question about public health, why have a quota? And it's this very quota that was at stake in TTIP. It had nothing whatsoever to do with health. So why make it a thing about health? Well, the same reason everything in the UK is stated in terms of the NHS. People rally around it, so make your issue somehow relevant. It's a trick as old as time itself. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you're as offended as I am at how the integrity of public health is not respected at all by politicians. Public health should be sacrosanct. People should not be frightened into support through fabricated fears. Personally, I think the opposition to vaccination owes a lot to people becoming jaded and untrusting about public health, so let's stop doing it now. If you're thinking at this point, well, if you think hormonal beef's so great, why don't you go and eat it? And that is a great idea. Raise money for me to go to America and I can eat steak and fried chicken. You can crow over pictures of me stuffing my face with that disgusting hormonal meat. It's a win-win situation. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Feel free to like, subscribe, or just watch some of my other videos, and I'll see you next time.